Hey, it's Nick here from Greyscalegorilla, and to celebrate the holidays and the new year, we're doing something that we've never done before, and that's update a classic Greyscalegorilla tutorial with a modern renderer. Now, like many of our classic tutorials, they were made in Physical Render, and we wanted to see what they would be like if we redid them using a modern renderer. Now, today I'm using Redshift for this tutorial, but you should be able to follow along no matter what renderer you're using. So for today's tutorial, we're gonna be updating this classic Goo Rock tutorial where Chris Schmidt shows you how to set up, rig, and animate this Goo Rock contraption inside of Cinema 4D from scratch. Now, if you wanna watch the original tutorial or get the scene file from the original tutorial, you can sign up for a free Greyscalegorilla account down below, and you'll have instant access to that and some other goodies just by becoming a free Greyscalegorilla member. So if you don't have an account, you can sign up for free down below. And of course, if you're a Greyscalegorilla Plus member, you already have instant access to this tutorial and everything else we've made here at Greyscalegorilla. All right, with that, let's get started and let's head on into Cinema 4D. All right, so here we are in Cinema 4D, and I have the original tutorial scene file open, and this is where we're going to be starting from. Now, don't forget, if you want to follow along from scratch, don't forget to sign up down below for this free tutorial, and you can also get the scene file there if you just want to start where I'm starting, which is where all this is made and animated and ready to go. So once you open the scene file, once you follow along, you should have, obviously, the Goo Rock, which is doing all this awesome stuff, all the animation, and it's all rigged, it's all animated, it's ready to go. Above that, you're going to see two sets of cameras. The first one is if you were a Greyscalegorilla Plus member and you have Signal, you could use the original cameras from the tutorial right here. And then if you don't have Signal, I baked these down so that you could still follow along even if you don't have Signal installed. So where do we start? Well, we have an original scene file here. We need to update it for Redshift. The first thing we need to do is turn on Redshift. And for that, I'm going to use my startup layout, which is my typical Redshift layout. And if you want to see how I made this, we have a YouTube tutorial on how I set up my layout. You could follow that right up here. I'm sure we'll link it up down below as well. Okay, so you go to Render Settings, you turn on Redshift. Pretty straightforward from here. After that, the Redshift menu should show up here at the top of your scene. If it doesn't show up, make sure you go to Edit, Preferences, go to Renderer, Redshift, and then click this button right here. It says Redshift Main Menu. After you do that, your Redshift menu should show up, and let's turn on the IPR here and see that we have some basic materials, but no lighting. I always love starting with lighting because everything else, your materials, your cameras, everything is based on light bouncing around. So let's get some basic lights going and we'll dial it in as we go. So in Redshift, we're going to go to lights. We're going to go to dome light, and already we're looking better. Now this is just a white dome light. We're going to replace it with an HDRI. Right here under the dome light, you could click this button and you could pick any HDRI that's in your computer to get started. And if you're a Greyscalegorilla Plus member, you could just drag texture into drop zone or just drag any one of our HDRIs right into texture and it will get going right away. It'll add that HDRI to your scene. If you drag it into drop zone, it'll make an HDRI link tag, and then any of our HDRIs that you click will just show up. Okay. So what do we do now? Well, now we should turn off the background. I don't need that background back there. So select your Redshift dome light, scroll down, and you'll see background. Just turn that off. And next thing we need to do is add some material to the rock. Let's start with the rock, and then we'll do this goo inside as well. Okay, so let's collapse all this stuff here, and let's open up our materials. And you can see here's the default materials. We just want to make a brand new one. Go to Create and go to Redshift Material Standard. And let's go ahead and replace this basic material with this new Redshift one. Now you can do this in a couple different ways. You can open up our Goo Rock null and you could replace each material separately. Or if you really just want to change it globally, I do this all the time. I drag a material on top of the material I want to replace and hold down the Option button. So I hold down Option, drag on top. It's going to put a white square around it. When you release it, it's going to replace anywhere that material is used with the new material. So now we have the updated material. which means we can go in here and start messing around. So of course you can make it different colors. You could change the roughness down and make it more glossy, or since it's a rock, you could turn it up a little bit more. So play around with these settings. I wanted to show you one that will make it look a little bit more like a rock. In this case, let me just make this more of a gray for now. And in your Redshift shader graph, go over your nodes and find a Maxon noise. Drag this into your scene and drag it on top of this little blue area. When you let go, it's going to show you all these options. You want to go to base and base color. And now your material has a noise on it instead of just plain color. Now this is where you can make it look a little bit more like a rock. And we're going to play around with some more textures here in just a bit. But to get this basic rock look, you can open up the Maxon noise and you can look at these different noise types. And I encourage you to just go through some of these because a lot of these look really cool, especially in this kind of more abstracted way. And some of these have some really cool patterns to them. And you could also change the color here to try to make something that looks more like a marble or more like a rock. So let's try this one, Hama. And I like this one a lot because it almost has a terrazzo kind of feeling to it. If we scale it up a little bit, we get these little flecks. Now, it's not as detailed as a lot of terrazzos out there, but if you just want a really quick look for these rocks, this is kind of a cool one. And then you could adjust your colors right here. So I want this black area to be more white. You never want full white, but that looks a little bit better. And then I'm just going to basically reverse the colors and make these flecks a little bit darker. And that gives us this kind of rock look here. And you can play around with the scale and just kind of dial this in. But this is a pretty good basic rock look. And the next thing I want to do here is get rid of these sharp edges. The original tutorial had these sharp edges with kind of a bevel on them, but they don't really show here. And what I want to do is round these out. It's going to catch a lot more light and look a lot less mechanical, a little bit more natural. So how do we quickly do that? Well, down here in the geometry, you can see we have a rock, we have the cap here. But if you just want to add more geometry, you could either put this inside of a subdivision surface, or you could use a Redshift tag to just add more geometry. And that's what I'm going to do because it's more efficient to do it this way. So let's go ahead and select this top rock here, go to tags, go to render tags, click on Redshift object, and inside the Redshift object, you're going to see this geometry tab. Make sure you turn on override and then turn on enabled. And you're going to see it rounds these corners. Let's zoom in. I'm going to turn off our camera here just so we could kind of fly around. And now we could see the difference. Now I'm going to set up some settings to make it a little bit quicker in the viewport. One of them is screen space adaptive. I'm going to turn that off. And then I'm going to turn the minimum edge length down. And you could turn down the maximum subdivisions as well. You don't need that many for this look. Sometimes you need to crank it up. But now you can see the difference. If we disable it on override here, you can see these sharp edges. And as soon as we turn it on, we get slightly more rounded edges. And as we zoom in, you can see the noise here breaks up when you zoom in too much. So you want to be careful with some of these noises. And I encourage you again to play around more with that. But we're going to take a different approach here in just a bit. Okay, so we have our rounded rocks on the top, which I think looks way better. Let's add it to the bottom. It's right down here under bottom rock. And I'm going to control drag this tag so it duplicates itself onto the bottom part of the rock. Okay, so we got the rock. What about the goo? Well, right now we just have this default blue that came with the scene file. And this is a physical material that we should just replace just like we did with the other one. So let's go to Redshift. Let's go to materials. Let's go to standard. And let's just do the same trick. I'm going to drag it on top of the goo. I'm going to hold down Option. That white box is going to be there. And then when I let go, it replaces it. Okay, so let's make it more gooey. So again, I double clicked on the material to open it up in the Redshift shader graph here. And here's where I want to mess with the colors, and we're going to add some luminance and subsurface scattering. So I think for the original or the final render for the new one, it ended up more like a slime, like a Nickelodeon slime, greenish yellow. And so let's dial that color in. It's definitely more yellow than I thought as I was playing with it. Every time I was like, I kept moving it more and more yellow, and it looked better and better. That's too much. Let's settle right around here. You don't want it too green. All right. So once you have that, we do have to duplicate this color down a little bit. So you can actually just right-click right on the color here and hit copy. And anywhere you want that color to be, you just paste it. So for one, I'm going to put it in subsurface. I'm just going to right-click and go to paste. And let's also go down to emission because we're going to do that a little bit later as well. So let's paste that color down there. So up in subsurface, let's just crank the weight for now. And you'll start to see some of the subsurface coming through. Now, before we dial in our subsurface, we're missing something really important whenever you're working with subsurface materials is a light that is really showing off the subsurface scattering. HDRIs do pretty good with subsurface scattering, but area lights work even better. So this is where I'm going to hit pause on working on my materials and start dialing in a little bit better lighting for this scene. Because just like I said before, your materials and your cameras, which are super important to your scene, always depend on your lighting. So you want to make sure your lighting is dialed in before you make final tweaks on all this. So let's just hit pause and start to work on the lighting. This is something I do all the time in scenes, and it's okay to bounce around. So what do? Let's go back to our wide camera, and I'm going to use the Signal one since I have Signal installed here, and we have this wide angle, and it's missing a few things. It's missing this area light, first of all, so let's go up to our Redshift menu. Let's go to Lights. Let's click on Area Light, and again, I'm going to jump off on my camera and spin around and see that we have an area light aimed backwards in our scene. We don't want that. We're going to grab it and move it behind our object. And the reason I want to do this is this will accentuate the subsurface scattering. Whenever you want your subsurface scattering to really show off, put a light off to the side or behind your object. I'll show you exactly what this means when we set it up. So let's scale this up. So a nice big area light that really puts a lot of light behind your object. And then you want to rotate it around. You could grab your rotate tool and rotate it. Or if you have these installed, you could use our rotate scripts and just click Y twice and it'll rotate it around 180 degrees. Let's move it back just a little bit more. And holy moly, we got way too much light here, but it is in the right position. So let's go back to our front camera. And you can see now we have this really cool effect that's starting to happen, which is it's rim lit. We have all this light creeping in through the cracks and in the goo, but it's just way too bright. So let's go into our light, go to exposure, and start to dial this down. We still want those nice reflections to show up. We just don't want it to be all blown out. So I'm just going to keep going until these reflections kind of die down. And this is looking better already. Now, before we dial in our final look for the subsurface scattering, which you can see, it's starting to work, folks. If we zoom into this, I like this pillar right there. You're starting to see this nice rim here, and you're starting to see the light bounce through the object. And we'll show a before and after here in a second, but the subsurface scattering does a lot to really make this goopy and kind of slimy. So let's jump back into our camera, and let's adjust our HDRI to just so we're in a better place with our lighting as we adjust the rest of these materials. So head back up to your Redshift dome light, and in this case, I'm going to use HDRI Link, which is already ready to go. I showed you how to do that earlier. And I'm going to use, I think it's called Hotel. Yeah, Chicago Skyline from Hotel. This is one I use all the time. Let me show you what it does. This HDRI is really unique because it's half outdoors. It's basically in a window ledge. So you have this beautiful sunset kind of colors from a city, a little bit cool, a little bit warm, but a nice sunset vibe. And then on the inside, basically on the opposite side of this HDRI, it's all indoor, incandescent, warm kind of colors. Hopefully you could see that there. You can see the warm side is facing the camera or facing this side of our object. And then the cool side's kind of bouncing off the sides, like a McDLT. It's like keeping the hot side hot and the cool side cool. So let's rotate this thing. We're going to rotate our HDRI until we get the cool side on the right. And it's a little bit brighter, so you can see it there in the animation. If you're using your HDRI, usually there's a bright point. Try to put it on the right side for this one. I think it helps. This needs a little bit more dialed in. So let's go to our object, and we're gonna add a little bit more exposure, and we could probably mess with this as we mess with more materials. But I'm also gonna knock the saturation down because while I like the cool and warm part, it's just a little bit too much for this. I'm gonna tone it down. While we're here, let's go ahead and make a background as well. Go to your Redshift menu, go to lights, go to dome light, and this is gonna be a backdrop. Now you can see when I added a second dome light, it added more light to the scene. And that's because by default, these lights are just white lights all around. If you don't want that, which we don't, we just want the background, you go into your details tab in your dome light and turn it down. So just crank all this stuff down. And now you can see it's only the backdrop and it's not affecting your scene. Although sometimes I do use these as a little bit of a fill light. I'll just crank up the diffuse and get a little bit of fill light where we need it. So keep that in mind. We may even use that later, but for now, we will turn it off, and you can make this any color you want, right? So you can come into your object and click on color, and we can make this any fun color, and we can dial it in as we go. Okay, so we have our goo, we have our rock, and things are looking pretty good. So let's check the close-up of this and try to dial in this goo a little bit. I'm gonna switch to my close-up cam. And now we get to our close-up cam. You can see it might be a little bit still too bright in here, but we are also missing kind of the glowy effect that is a part of this look. And for that, I literally just added a little bit of glow, not glow, some actual light volume inside of my shader. So we already set up the color. If you just double click on your material, scroll down, and you're gonna find emission. So emission is like turning up the light bulb as if this whole thing was a light bulb. And if I crank it up to 2, you're going to see it's just way too bright. So dial this way back and creep it up. It only takes a little bit for this to feel like it's glowing. That is looking good. Now, that red I chose for the background, pretty bad, guys, pretty bad. But, I love the color, so I just go to it sometimes. I think for the final render, we ended up with like a purplish, darker purple. So let's try to dial that in, and you'll see it's going to look a lot better against the color of this slime. We may have to add a little bit more green back into that slime color, but this is already feeling a lot better, maybe a little bit darker, a little bit less saturated, but not by much. It's kind of got a Ninja Turtles slime feel as well, which is totally cool with me. Let's go back to our front camera and see how this is looking. All right. I'm digging the background. I'm digging the goo. I think we're going to dial in while we're here just a little bit more green into this subsurface. So let's just grab that and push it a little bit more green. Oh, what a difference. Barely changed it, folks. Barely changed it, but it's got definitely more of a green slime, ooze, turtles vibe going, which I think is fun. You could customize it. As you know, you make this whatever you want, but I'm having fun here trying to get some green slime. Okay, so where can we go from here? Well, we're going to work on the cameras. I think before we do that, I did want to show you the material I ended up using on the rocks, which I thought really helped it. It's totally different from the original, and it's one of our Greyscalegorilla Plus materials under the metals collection. So if you scroll down, if you're a Greyscalegorilla Plus member and you're following along, go grab one of these metals. So here they are, Metals Volume 1 Redshift. I'm going to hit clear on our library. And a lot of these actually ended up looking really cool on this object. But the one I used was lead. So lead 01. And again, I'm just going to drag this into our scene, hold down Option, and totally replace this material. You're going to see it automatically will replace it in the scene and in the render. Boom. So now we got the rocks. We still have the roundness. I do think we got to scale this up a little bit. I'm going to select the material that's on the object. I'm going to hold down Control to select the other material. And let's just turn up the UV coordinates here. Instead of 50%, I think it needs to be scaled way up. So I'm going to go to 200%. And that is looking better. It might even go a little bit higher. Let's go to 300 by 300. And let's go back to the zoomed in camera and go back in our timeline and start to find parts of the scene where you're looking at this material close up. Anytime you're working with scaling materials, you really want to make sure you're zoomed in as far as you're going to be so that you're not overscaling your materials. It's just to double check. I think I went a little bit too far. So let's just head back here and dial this back to 200. And that way we're not overscaling the material where you're going to see any imperfections or anything like that. But that looks really good. The metal looks good. Let's look at it closed before it turns into goo. We got some nice rounding. We got some good materials here. Let's zoom out. That looks great. I'm going to grab my dome light and rotate it a little bit more to bring a little bit more light into the front and watch it open. Let's just pick a couple frames here to check it. That looks good. We might tone down the brightness of the goo a little, but man, that looks pretty good. Let's go back to our zoomed in camera and let's go ahead and just pick a few frames. So a little slice of neon and open up a little bit. We got the rocks. The goo might be a little bit bright here, but we could dial that back. And then when it's all the way open, there's still shadow, there's still detail. It's a little bit bright here. Maybe we just tone down that. This backlight is doing a ton of work here. So if we just turn that off, yeah, boo. Yes, too bright. All right, just a little, just a bit, just a bit. Okay, that is definitely looking better. Okay, so the other thing we're missing is depth of field and any other camera effects that are just not a part of normal cameras until you turn them into Redshift cameras. So you can see here, included in the scene file, and this is true for any scene that you open from the past, right? If you're like me, you've been using Physical Render for years and years. You have old scene files, just like we're using here, that have these cameras. So what if you want to upgrade your camera to a Redshift camera? Well, this is how I do it. I'm sure there's other ways to do it, but I like starting fresh with a brand new Redshift camera. So come up to your Redshift menu. Let's go to cameras, click on standard. And this is one of those brand new Redshift cameras that's new in the latest version of Cinema. And it's ready to go, right? So I can dial in my depth of field. Let's just go click on this camera. And let's just pick a part of the scene here and dial in a little bit of depth of field. And then I'm going to show you how to match these cameras as well. So let's go to our object and let's go to bokeh. So optical, and we go down to aperture and we turn on bokeh. So that's step one. Now, because this object is so large, we really have to cheat our aperture. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If I click a cube, that's the size of a cube, and a cube default is 200 centimeters cubed. And so that means this goo rock is a big, okay? Now, here's the issue. We can't scale the goo rock down because it's all rigged, and it's going to break the rig. So how do you fake things looking small, even though they're big? Well, one way to do it is to break your aperture. It's to go below what a normal lens would go. Now, if you've ever shot with DSLR or done video with one of those Nikon's cameras, Fuji's, one of those Sony fans, you know that lenses usually kind of stop at like 1.2, 1.4 f-stop range. But you could go lower than that in cinema. So I'm going to break it and go to 0.2. What does this mean? Well, it means we're faking the camera lens to be even bigger aperture so that it looks like our object is smaller than what it is. And so there's a lot of scaling and optical science behind all this stuff, but you can break things like this if you cannot shrink the things in your scene. So from here, we could look at, okay, now we got some good depth of field going on. That's looking nice. Let's go ahead and grab a focus null. I'm going to click the null. I'm going to name it focus. And inside that Redshift camera, under object, I'm going to say use this as the focus null. And we're going to go all the way back to 0 here. And we're going to pick this area right there in the front to be in focus just for now. I'm going to select the focus null. I'm going to select the place tool, and I'm just going to click and drag in my scene where I want my camera to be in focus. And it's going to pick right there, which is right there in my scene. And now, no matter where I zoom out in or out to, that will remain in focus, okay? And we can adjust that later as we go. So we solved that part, but how do we make it match these cameras right here. So let's say we want to match, I'll close this so we don't have as many cameras open. Let's say we want to match this wide cam. So this wide cam was made years ago. Here's the original Redshift, or the original Cinema 4D camera. How do we basically put this camera in the exact same place? Well, here's how I do it. I make it a child of the original camera, and I like to keep the original camera there just in case I want to check the old settings, or maybe there's something in the bokeh or something I did in the past that I want to reference. I like to keep the original camera. I make the new one a child of the camera, but you'll see if I click on it, it's in a completely different place. And it's going to animate because that camera is animated, but it's nowhere near the original. The original is way out here. So with the original camera, come down and click this button right here in your interface. It's going to open up your transform settings, and you can just click on Reset Transform, and it's going to put that camera exactly where your other camera is. So now they both have the same exact point of view here, except this camera has a different focal length. If I go in the object of my new camera, it is 100 millimeters, and the old one was 36. Look at that. So let's go ahead and just change this one to 36. And now we should get exactly the same when we click between these two. This is what we want. Perfect. Okay, so how do we do that for the second one? Same thing. I'm going to go ahead and Control-C, Control-V to duplicate my camera, and I'm going to make it a child of my close-up camera. Now, my close-up camera is way up here doing this rotate thing, and in this case, Signal's rotating it around, and we got a little movement. But again, if I click on my camera, I'm way out here again. It's still spinning. Same thing. Come down to Reset Transform, click it, and check your focal length. In the original camera, it's 100. So we got to reverse this. Go into this camera, click on 100, and now we have the exact same camera reference using the old camera. So, okay, so what does this mean? Well, now that we have this set up, as long as we keep the Redshift camera selected and we hit render now in our IPR, we should see the depth of field, and we should see all the animation ready to go, so we can basically replicate that old scene, that old animation that was created. That still looks good. The keyframes still look good, but with updated materials, updated lighting, updated depth of field that is able to be more beautiful here than in the past when we only had physical render to mess with. Okay, so here's where I'm checking frames. And right here, I'm realizing while I like the rock in focus, as soon as it leaves frame, it is just too blurry for me, folks. So let's go ahead into our focus null. And instead of being focused on the front of that rock, why don't we put it right here on that piece of slime? So now this will be more in focus. And let's make sure our focus null is working here under the camera. I closed my camera. Let's go into there. Let's go into optical. It is set to focus, and it looks like maybe if we just scrub through here, it will clean up. All right, that's looking a little better. That's in focus. Let's make sure that that is exactly where we want it to be. Maybe it's, oh, there is something on the outside of this object that is keeping this focus null from going inside of the object. Check this out. If I look at the top of my scene, I expected this focus null to be way, let me zoom in. I expected this focus null to be way in here where the slime is. It's way outside. So it's hitting something like one of these boundaries. So we may have to place this by hand, old school, and just kind of push it in the middle of the scene here. And hopefully when we do that, that is the effect I wanted. So be careful of that with this focus null trick. Sometimes other objects like whatever's in this rig can get in the way. Some deformers or something was blocking it. So be aware of that. I manually fixed it. And now if we look at our render, this is looking way better. Okay, so I'm checking frames. Let's check the end of the animation. That's looking a little bit bright. We could tone that light down once again, just to make sure we're not overpowering. And while we're looking through here, let's go ahead and go back a little bit. more closed rock situation, and check with a couple more parts of this render that I think need a little bit of tweaking. So if you're using Redshift for this, go ahead here and open up this little tab, go to your settings, and I apologize for it being so small, but I am recording a tutorial, so I usually try to scale my screen up for you guys. Inside of these post effects, come down, we're gonna adjust two very important settings for this final look. One is a LUT. So turn on LUTs, and you'll see one of them just automatically got applied. I'm gonna override that by clicking LUT file. And I'm gonna use one of the built-in Redshift ones. Chad Ashley showed me this one. I've been using it a lot lately too. It's called Advantix 200. It's a nice little warming LUT file. And you can see, actually, let me zoom out to this other camera. You can see it adds a lot more warmth, and it did darken things a little bit, so we may have to adjust our lighting, but I'm also gonna tone this down. So here's the original, here's the LUT, and I'm just gonna do it a little bit like 40, 50%, just to give it a little bit more warmth in the scene. So let's dial this in over here as well. Let's go to our zoomed in camera. Not bad. The other thing I want to adjust while we're here is a little bit of bloom and glow on this slime. So under bloom, you could select this little checkbox right here, and you could turn down your threshold until you start to see this bloom. So I'm just going to go until this white stuff starts to really glow up, and then we're going to tone it down using the intensity slider. So here's the bloom. It's coming in. It's got the slime bloom. It's got the light bloom. And I'm going to turn down the softness so it doesn't blow out that much. And then I'm going to tone this intensity way back. This is an effect that could get a little overboard very quickly because it looks so cool sometimes when you crank it, but try to keep this subtle. I'm going to dial this back like by more than half, and that looks a little bit more tasteful. You could toggle it on and off just to see the difference. Very subtle effect, but now you can see this bloom happening. Let's go back to the original camera to double check our lighting from out here. After that LUT, I'm going to dial up our HDRI. And don't be afraid, it's okay. Materials, lighting, and cameras all are interacting at all times to create a subtly different effect. So if you play with something and you like the overall look, but it's still a little bit dark, maybe you need to crank your lights back up. Maybe you need to adjust your camera settings. It's okay to mess with this stuff until the final moment. In this case, I'm just gonna crank up our brightness on our HDRI. I'm going to definitely darken that purple the more I look at it, the like too purpley it is. And so let's do that right before we finish up here. Let's go to our material and make it less saturated. And let's play around a little bit with the color. So this turns it a little bit more blue. Not what I'm going for. If I go too far, we got a magenta. But something like this is feeling a little bit better. I am missing a little bit of that rim light, especially on this scene. So I am going to cheat it just a little bit by leaving it for this scene. Okay, so I don't want to adjust the backlight for this scene because it's going to blow out my goo. So here's where I would either save a different scene file or start using takes in Cinema 4D. We have videos about how to use takes as well. If you're interested, I'll link it up down below. We'll link it up here on YouTube as well. But I'll either do takes or different scene files to create slightly different looks. In other words, in this look, in this scene, I want this rim light and this backlight to really bling out this side of the goo. And in this camera, right here, it's not enough. So in other words, you could cheat this and just say, in this scene, I'm going to brighten up my rim light. And that way we get this rim coming in. We get a little bit more light coming in. But you could see when we zoom in, too much. We got to dial it back. So this is okay. It's okay to have different setups. You don't want to drastically change it, but sometimes you do want to art direct each camera setup to make sure it's as beautiful as possible. As long as you're not changing too much, it will cut together just fine. So from here, I simply made two renders. I rendered out this part of the scene, and then I zoomed in to this camera and I rendered out this part of the scene. And I'll tell you one more thing before I show you the final render. inside of my render settings under output, I definitely turn my frame rate up to 48. And in fact, your scene, when you go in here, it's automatically, auto-magically, I should say, gonna be 48. And that's because that's what we used in the original scene, was exactly 48. So keep this in mind. I rendered it at double the frame rate and then slowed it down to original 24 frames per second in the final render. And that gave us a lot more animation to play with. It opened up slower. So something to keep in mind as we head into After Effects. So after you render this stuff out, I'm going to quickly hop into After Effects, and we're going to see the final animation and some other little subtle tweaks that I added to it. All right, so here we are in After Effects, and you can see the final animation, and I cut between the zoomed up close up and the final. And again, I cheated a little bit. I'm using that word a lot because I want you to understand that cheating is okay. This is motion graphics. This is not a math exam. Whatever looks good and whatever makes sense to the animation is what you should do. So what I'm doing to cheat here is I'm using this animation until it's open pretty far. And then when I cut to the zoom in, you can see I close it a little bit. I start with it closed a little bit more and get even more out of this open. And then I cheat again when I cut back. It's still not open all the way, and it's down further, and it keeps going. So in other words, it's not a linear cut as if this was filmed live. I'm pushing the ins and outs to extend and accentuate the goopy part, which is to me the coolest part. This part. Add some sound effects in there. There you go. Just for you guys. So not a lot going on here, except I wanted to show you that I added a little bit of vignette in here just to focus in on the original subject and to kind of draw your eye in. And then I did add a little bit of extra glow here with this little layer. All this is a color layer that I put a mask on, I feathered it, and then I animated the opacity from 0 up to looks like around 40%. And all this does, I'll put this on loop. All this does is add a little bit of like green glow. It's like opening the Pulp Fiction suitcase, you know, you got a little glow popping out of there. Makes that noise. So here's the little effects there. Let's take one more look at the final render as we wrap up this updated classic tutorial from years ago to a brand new Redshift render. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and do me a quick favor. If you've gotten this far, let me know in the comments what you thought about this type of tutorial, and if we do more classic tutorials, which one you would like to see updated next. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and we hope to see you in another video really soon. Bye, everyone.